Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
The Defense Department has begun using new strategic hiring committees to vet civilian employees. But nearly a year after the Trump administration ordered agencies to create them, there's still a lot we don't know about how they work. 4 committees now operate across the Pentagon and military departments, but DoD has provided few details about how many hires they review, how often they reject candidates, or whether they're actually slowing the hiring process. Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen has been digging into what these committees are doing. She joins me now with more on what they could mean for the Pentagon's civilian workforce. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Terry.
Let's start at the beginning. What are these hiring committees, and why did the Trump administration want to create them in the first place?
So they were created under a Trump executive order last October as a way to give senior officials more control over civilian hiring across the federal government. So at DoD, there's now 4 committees, one for each of the military departments. So one for Army, one for Navy and the Marine Corps, and then another one for the Air Force and Space Force, and then one covering the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the other defense agencies. So, DHA, Missile Defense Agency, so on and so forth. So they're supposed to make sure that hiring decisions line up with the administration's priorities, what the agency itself needs, and what DoD is calling merit-based practices and critical mission requirements.
What do we actually know about how they work and how they make those kinds of decisions? What kind of data do they collect?
So we're not entirely sure what kind of data they collect, and that's one of the issues here, right? DoD hasn't said how many hires have gone through these committees, how many candidates have been rejected, or, even exactly which types of jobs are subject to additional review. We know a little bit about how the Air Force's committee works. It meets every 2 to 4 weeks. It reviews individual hiring requests for exemptions from the hiring freeze, which has sort of thawed a little bit at this point, and the department's staffing plan overall. But, the Air Force still wouldn't say how many hires its committee has approved or denied, or what types of positions are being exempted.
The Pentagon has been pretty vocal about trying to reduce its hiring cycle time. How do these committees fit into that schedule? Do they just add time, or are they saving it somewhere else?
So the concern is anytime you add something, another layer of oversight in, right, like that slows things down because there's more people that have to get involved and sign off on things. So, nobody would answer directly how it's affecting the timeline. The Army said they have put workarounds in place to avoid delays. So that, kind of indicates that there were delays that they needed to work around. The department hired more civilians in the first 6 months of 2026 than it did in the same period in 2025, right when the Trump administration came in, implemented the hiring freeze. But it's still not anywhere near the hiring levels, the Biden administration of other previous administrations. So, the civilian workforce overall is still shrinking. And there's anecdotal evidence floating out there that positions get stuck in these approval processes. So hiring's still going, but, it still appears that the committees can be creating bottlenecks.
Rachel, do we have any information on which particular hiring actions these committees are considering? Is it all grades, all skill sets? Is it just senior positions? Is it just critical skill set? What's actually within their purview?
That's one of the things I'm trying to find out. The assumption by, folks like those at the Partnership for Public Service and other smart people that are watching these play out, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, depending on which agency you're looking at and the determinations that they're making for their own folks. But, I think for the higher up sort of SES kind of positions, maybe higher GS, their thought is these panels have, more involvement in that than they might, for kind of just the rank and file, program office sort of folks. But, I think that it depends on service by service. I think it probably depends on, the time that each of them have. Maybe it's a situation where they're, kind of batch approving, lower level folks and then giving higher level folks a little more consideration. But, we don't know. The information that's kind of out there so far is the people that they're paying the most attention to are the ones who are working on, the Trump administration's kind of higher priority efforts. So, things like space operations, Golden Dome, so on and so forth. But the scope of that is still pretty unclear.
Do you know how this intersects with moving folks to schedule policy career? Are those two Venn diagrams aligned?
That's another thing we don't know. That's a question that Jenny Mattingly at Partnership for Public Service raised. She said we're seeing more and more jobs pop up on USA Jobs that say schedule PC. Is that in the purview of these hiring committees to, change jobs to schedule PC as they're going through the process? Are schedule PC folks vetted by them? What does that look like? So, that's another thing that I'm going to keep trying to figure out.
Well, these seem to be part of the hiring landscape for the near future, at least. What will you be watching to see how all of this plays out?
Yeah, so I want to see more transparency around our workload and their outcomes. How many positions are being reviewed, how quickly, how many are rejected, and, for what reasons? And are these critical positions actually being filled faster and by people, with the right qualifications? A question that I have is for positions in critical areas like shipbuilding, right? Or, anywhere else that has vacancies. Are there jobs that are still sitting empty because a hiring committee said, well, we don't really like something Bob did, a couple months ago, or, what have you, are they prioritizing hiring for certain positions that the administration is placing higher importance on, but aren't necessarily what DoD sees as critical? So, how does that actually affect getting people in the jobs that need to be filled?
And does DoD have a plan to provide that level of transparency?
Not as far as, not that they've given me so far, but, I encourage them to do it at some point.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for this update. Really important news.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com.